Hello and welcome to review number 1 here at the Pizza Locust channel. Well, this is not the review I wanted to do for number 1, but fate has dealt me the hand that it has dealt me. So today we're going to be looking at Lou Malnati's thin crust Chicago style pizza. Lou Malnati's is a famous Chicago deep dish pizza chain. They were founded in 1971 in Illinois, and they have subsequently moved out into the world. They opened their first branch in Phoenix in 2016. I have eaten a few, not many, but a few of their deep dish pizzas. I can't say I'm a fan, but I don't hate them or anything, but I just am not particularly into that style of pizza. I have had Chicago deep dish pizzas. I had one from a place called Giordano's, which is also a Chicago chain that tried moving into the Phoenix area and didn't make it. And it was better. It was better. I would have preferred that over the Lou Malnati's variation, but that's not what this review is about. This review is about their thin crust, which I only recently learned that they had. So I was in a shopping plaza where Lou Malnati's happens to be at just about lunchtime when they were opening up, and I said, that is what I'm having for lunch today. That was January 13th at about 11 a.m., and they do open at 11 a.m. Maybe that has something to do with how this turned out. Don't know. I ordered the small, thin pepperoni pizza, which measured out to 22 centimeters in diameter. Going forward, we're going to compare the price of pizza by the square centimeter, but we'll need a few more pizzas to start getting that to shake out. Lou Malnati's small thin crust pepperoni pizza cost $13.94. At 22 centimeters across, that's approximately 380 square centimeters, or a cost per square centimeter of 3.7 cents. I was warned it would take 30 minutes for the pizza to be ready. Now, I have been at Lou Malnati's before, and I've ordered pizzas, and they always tell you it's going to take 30 to 40 minutes. But that's for a deep dish pizza. That's for a pizza that's that thick. But a thin crust, I was really surprised that they made that statement. It took 40 to 45 minutes to get my pizza, which seemed excessive at best. And it also looked bad. Lou Malnati's has poor lighting. I guess it's supposed to be mood lighting, but it makes all their food look unappetizing rather than appetizing. So when the pizza arrived, the cheese just didn't look fantastic. It had a sheen to it that wasn't oil and wasn't hot melty cheese, and there was but one or perhaps 1.5 pieces of pepperoni visible on the top. Again, not quite sure what to expect, but their deep dish pizza, the pepperoni comes underneath the cheese. But odd that there was some popping up and visible on the top. Made me worried. It was also cut square, which is never a good thing, because then you've always got some pieces in the middle that don't have a bit of the nice tasty crust out at the edge. So let's talk about the experience of the pizza itself. First bite, crunched. It crunched. It crunched so loudly that the only other people in the restaurant, who were about 3 booths away from me, turned to look at me. It was amazing, the crunch on that pizza, and not in a good way. I mean, it didn't break my teeth, but it was definitely not what I was expecting or what I would typically enjoy. And most of the crust was that way, although that last piece in the middle was soft and bready. Well, no, bready's not the right word, but we'll come back to that. It was softer. It wasn't crunchy like all of the outer pieces. Lou Malnati's uses, and I'm pretty certain I'm not wrong here, the same crust for this pizza that they do for their deep dish pizza. And that's one of the reasons I don't really kind of like their deep dish pizza, is that despite the fact that it's their famous butter crust, it doesn't taste like butter, which would be good. It doesn't taste like much of anything, which is the bad. And it's also has I'm guessing there's a certain percentage of corn flour or corn meal in their dough, because it has that texture that you get with a coarse grain flour. I guess we'll call it a flour or meal. But corn doesn't really taste very good for cooking a pizza dough either. So I'm not a fan of their big deep dish crust, and I certainly was not a fan of this one, which was too hard and was not imparting any flavor into it. The only flavor it imparted, and this was not a good thing either, was, how do I describe this? Burnt Parmesan. Okay, that's how we'll describe it. But if you've ever been to some fancy restaurants, when they give you a salad, they'll make what they call a Parmesan crisp, which I believe is you grate up some Parmesan, spread it on a griddle, let it melt and harden, and then serve that with the salad. First time I ever got one of those, I thought, I am gonna love this. Cheese. No, it's not a good thing. It's an unpleasant experience. And I like Parmesan cheese, but not like that. This crust had that flavor in places, not everywhere. And I looked at the bottom of every piece of this pizza, and I saw no evidence of burnt Parmesan contamination on the bottom of it. And yet it had that flavor, and that was not good. So it's off to a bad start, off to a really bad start. So let's take a look at the cheese. It was congealing. It had been melted, it had been heated up, and it was now getting cold. It wasn't cold, it was warm, but it had re-solidified. And that's why it had that old melted mozzarella look like you get out of the refrigerator the next day. That's inexcusable. And I can't help wondering if the pizza really did take 30 minutes and they just took 10 minutes to get it to me or more. Because this had the feel of a pizza that's been sitting there for a while. Not good. Not good. The sauce, and it also had that flavor. You know, mozzarella tends to lose some of its flavor when it's gone cold. And that's not good. I mean, this review is a litany of that was not good, which I think will reflect in the score afterwards. The sauce was impossible to tell. I mean, there was sauce there. I'm not saying there wasn't, and I'm not saying it didn't have flavor, but I couldn't isolate it. Typically what I do is I try to find a spot and pull the cheese back and then take a little bit of the sauce just by itself to get a feel for what it tastes like. Couldn't do that with this pizza. It was too bound up in all the other ingredients. So I really couldn't tell. I'm not going to rate the sauce. Just wasn't standing out. Part of the reason I couldn't rate it was because I was completely wrong about the pepperoni. It was not too low on pepperoni. It had way, way too much pepperoni. They had laid down an absolute solid layer of pepperoni underneath the cheese, which is what they do with the deep dish. So I shouldn't have been too surprised by that. I think it was just that piece on the top that threw me off, that I was thinking, wait a minute, maybe they put it on the top for this. But no, they put it underneath, and there was That was too much. I never thought I would ever say that, but for this amount of crust, for this amount of cheese, it was too much. It stood out like it wasn't part of the pizza, but like it was misplaced flavor. Not good, but worse. It gets worse. Some of the pepperoni was burnt. How did that happen? How can the pepperoni, which is entirely underneath the pizza, have pockets of burnt pepperoni? Now, my theory, no, let's call it a hypothesis. It's not a theory. It's not that well grounded in facts. My hypothesis is that they lay down the layer of pepperoni on the crust and they cook the crust and the pepperoni and perhaps the sauce for a while. Maybe even there's some cheese underneath that. I'm not sure. It was really hard to tell. And then they take it out and they put more cheese on top of it and they cook it some more. If that's the case, it would explain how they were able to burn the pepperoni, but it also doesn't explain how once they burned the pepperoni, the cook didn't look at it and go, oops, better tell him it's going to be 45 minutes and let's start again. But there you go. Pepperoni, not good. So I love pizza and it kills me to do this, but that pizza was so bad that had this been any other restaurant that I'd walked into at random and sat down and had a pizza that bad, I would never, ever again go have that pizza. But here's the thing. Lou Malnati's has got a reputation. And when I mentioned that I had had a Lou Malnati's pizza, without telling people what I thought of it, they all chimed up and said, oh, I love their thin crust. That's their best pizza they make. And in fact, as I sat there, there weren't a lot of people in the restaurant, but there were a few. And they all ordered thin crust pizzas. Maybe it's because it's lunchtime and they didn't have, 2 hours to wait. But Lou Malnati's does do a lunch deep dish personal pizza that, they have kind of pre-worked on so you can get them in and out at lunchtime. Clearly they didn't do that with the thin crust, and maybe that's why people were ordering the thin crust. It certainly wasn't because of the quality of the one I had on that day. So the thing is, never again is what I would say about this pizza, but with a reputation like Lou Malnati's, it makes me think that this was a fluke, that this was an accident, bad cook, bad day, somebody forgot my pizza, they stuck it on a bookshelf somewhere and waited for a while and they go, oh my gosh, we need to get that guy his pizza, or whatever, and that they didn't realize how poorly they were serving up a pizza to a customer. I could have complained. It was bad enough that I almost complained, and I've never in my life done that about a meal in a restaurant unless it's uncooked. Like I get an uncooked chicken. I've sent an uncooked chicken back once. It's the only thing I've ever complained about at a restaurant. I prefer just to pay and walk out and then consider the fact that I have paid for the privilege to complain about the pizza for years to come, or the meal for years to come. And perhaps that's what's going to be happening here. Or perhaps I'll go at a different time of day, or maybe even a different location, and try one more, but not anytime soon. So I'm putting this one on the scale as a D. And that is one of the very few pizzas I've ever had in my life that I would rank that lowly. I honestly can't think of a pizza that was worse. Now, I'm sure I've had a worse pizza, but I can't think of a pizza off the top of my head that I thought was so poor. In the meantime, until we come up with our next review, I hope you all get a chance to get out and find a great slice of pizza.